the pleasure of introducing our panelists this morning. Our panelists actually came from three ways of building business. One is a person who builds business himself, is currently building a business, and one is helping other businesses to build partnerships and relationships and construct networks. And then we have two venture capitalists that are investing in developing those options. So three perspectives that we'll be having. The first panelist I want to introduce is Clay Winkle. So Clay is a graduate of Stanford GSB, and he is currently working to build a business, working with multiple parties to build partnerships between Europe and the rest of the world on triple play and voice over IP carrier equipment companies in Europe and then with the US side as well. This is the type of work that he has done a lot in building global technology development centers across the globe with companies like Google, like Intel, like Microsoft, Samsung. So those are the global powers. And he himself also has deep expertise in besides the globe, but also in the European side, the Europe, Eastern Europe, Central Europe, And our second panelist on his right is Randy Hedrick. So Randy is the founder and the CEO of Fitness Anywhere, Inc., and this company is the leading producer of body weight training equipment and exercise programming. And he also has a 13-year career in the Navy SEALs. And in fact, it's during those tenure that he came up with all these ideas and developing the current business. He also is a graduate of Stanford GSB. And next to Randy is Hau Lee. Hau is a general partner at Altos Ventures. Altos Venture is he's also a co-founder of that venture as well. This venture focuses on investments in the area of networking, storage, and semiconductor. He also has experience as a VC at Trinity and also working for Bain Company. He graduated from GSB as well. And our fourth panelist to counter the three GSB graduates actually has an MBA from Harvard. He's the one who is on his way coming, Michael Shea. Let me just introduce him at this time. Michael is the president of Lee & Fung USA Investments. So Lee & Fung is an Asian-based company, and he invests in that. He's the investment arm of Lee & Fung. Lee & Fung is a big trading and supply chain conglomerate in Asia. Prior to joining Lee & Fung USA Investments, Michael was a principal at RH Chapel, also a venture capital firm in San Francisco, investing mostly in technologies and biotech startups. He has an MBA from Harvard. Michael's car broke down on the way coming over here, so there is a pickup, but he should be here anytime, we hope. So this reminded me of an interesting anecdote that I want to share with you. When we talk about leveraging low-cost countries, you always have to worry about infrastructure. Infrastructure could be roads, where cars can break down all the time, or electricity supply may not be there, it may not be reliable, and those are things that you have to worry about. You don't think of having to worry about in California, but Michael has this car breakdown problem. A few years ago, we have Michael Marks, who is with KKR right now, and he was the CEO of Flashtronics, which of course have invested in low-cost countries, in Hungary, in China, in Mexico, in Sao Paulo. And he was speaking at Stanford, giving a talk, and he talked about the importance of building infrastructure when you move to low-cost countries. You don't just move and outsource offshore. You have to make sure the road systems are reliable, the electricity supply are reliable, and utilities, safety, everything you have to do. Unlike in California, which of course we take things for granted, and we don't have to worry about that. And just as he was speaking on this point, the lights went off and the electricity went off at Stanford. And it was at a time when California was going through rolling blackouts in coal. Those few years when we have this problem. And that became a nice laughing kind of a joke because we were all talking about the importance of making sure low-cost countries have those infrastructure in place, but those things can happen in California. So Michael's car broke down this morning. Anyway, I am going to use the following format. We have a small crowd, and so we can have more intimate discussions with our panelists. I'm going to start with a few key questions that I thought are interesting questions, and so self-certain. Those are my questions, and I want to ask them first. But then I want to open it up with the rest of the audience that if we ask questions, comment on their perhaps points that they made, reactions on their points, and then we have a good discussion. So we'll run until 12 o'clock. Okay. So that was the format. And if questions, my questions, of course, can be applied to any panelist. But if you raise questions, you also can ask any panelist to address, or you can be specific. Say, these questions I want Clay to answer. So that's also fine. Yeah. So these are the rules of the game. So my first question, and I think I have 4 very good questions. Yeah. So the first question is that in recent years, I think moving to low-cost country for manufacturing, for all kinds of operations and functions seems to be the trend. So that's why we have this term offshoring, outsourcing, the double O. But most of the times, I think we heard about large companies doing it. It's more the Hewlett Packards of the world, the Cisco of the world. Hi, Michael, please. Yeah, okay, yeah. This, by the way, is Michael Shea, and I have given you a great introduction to you. Yeah. Thank you. Yeah. Well, thank you for being able to join us. Yes. So the first question that I want to raise is that we have seen more established and maybe mature companies that move to low-cost countries to leverage the so-called low cost in those countries. Do you see similar trend of maybe smaller, because I think this is the entrepreneurial conference, so we are interested in both developing entrepreneurs, small ventures, small companies which aspire to become big, but is that a game for small companies as well, or is it mostly games for the Hewlett Packard of the world, for the Cisco of the world type? Yeah. So I wonder if any of our panelists would care to comment on this question.
Well, I can certainly address that from the perspective of a small company. I started it a year and a half after graduating from Stanford. I actually started it before that. We had our first beta version of a product about a year and a half after graduating, and I had the sense that this was the only way that I'd be able to afford creating a consumer product was to, and really where some of the advantages would be is to offshore it. I learned a huge number of things about offshoring as a small company, particularly with a product that hasn't really matured. And I would say sort of a fairly strong opinion on this, given where we are now, which is, coming up on 3 years down the road and doing very well. We learned some excruciating lessons about doing R&D from 4,000 miles away. And, it wasn't R&D as in I have an idea and I want to bring it to into being in China. We thought we had a fairly well solidified product line, but what we found out was that there's a lot of things that can go wrong in 4,000 miles, that as a small company, to get back to the professor's question, the impact is really significant, whereas Cisco, the impact of a glitch in an emerging product may not be something that's quite so significant, although I do think that there's a lot of small companies are choosing to start over with overseas production. And I definitely have some more things to talk about if anybody wants to talk in more specifics about that once my fellow panelists have had something to say.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Well, thank you. Randy? Yeah, others?
Well, as a very small venture capital firm, I was actually surprised when I added up the people we have in different locations. We have over 1,000 employees in places like China, Ukraine, Philippines, India, Korea, Bulgaria. But having said that, I guess I want to be a little bit contrarian. In the businesses that we are involved with, when the primary driver is cost, those outsourcing or offshoring efforts tend to fail. For us, it's not about cost. It's about finding the best people, finding the best talent anywhere in the world, wherever they might be. And that's the companies that have done it for those reasons have, by and large, been fairly successful. If you're just trying to reduce costs, and if you think somehow as a startup you're going to gain some kind of competitive advantage by going offshore, I don't think there's much there. I think the large companies are much more able to leverage offshore operations because they have infrastructures. As a small company, it's hard to get a culture. It's hard to have integrated operations globally. It's more difficult, I would say, than for large companies.
Yes, Michael.
The companies that I invest in, which are consumer products, most of them are making their products offshore. So there's a tremendous amount of pressure, particularly from their buyers, to go offshore for production. And I think, just picking up on what both of you have said, I think for a lot of small companies, their value added typically is in innovation. And so when that's their expertise and they try to become a low-cost provider, particularly very early on, I think it creates a lot of conflict within the organization. And all of a sudden they're fighting multiple fronts because their customers are asking for new product development, new product innovation from them. And at the same time, they're trying to work with vendors 6,000 miles away and trying to manage the supply chain while they're still experimenting with the product in the marketplace. I think typically creates a tremendous amount of problems. So typically when we look at companies that are early stage, we try to advise them that they really should focus their manufacturing domestically first so that they can go through several cycles of learning before they go offshore, despite the pressure from their customers to get as low cost as possible.
Well, I can mention that a lot of my focus has been in a similar vein in echoing what Hau has said about going offshore for finding talent, for finding the world-class development, innovation, creativity that may be advantageous in creating your first products. And I've done that in one part of the world in Central Europe successfully with digital audio equipment in the mid-90s when I left 3Com. I was formerly with 3Com running their OEM business worldwide. But low cost is one aspect. I think more in tune with operations, lower skilled labor, manufacturing environments. But in terms of innovation and design, in order to do that as a small company, there has to be something beyond an arm's length relationship with a vendor. You have to have a close partnership, a shared business, people that share in the rewards, close personally as well as business-wise. So it's not a normal arm's length relationship when those things work well. And you want to make sure that you're working with a diligent organization that's led by an excellent leader. Communications have to be sharp, as if they're down the road from you in terms of responsiveness on the phone, email. It can't be a normal vendor-supplier customer environment. So
I'm struck by the point that some of you have observed that companies are moving to low-cost countries not for the sake of low cost. Yeah, so because I think that seems like exactly the intent to go to low-cost countries because the costs are low. And so it must be because of the availability of talent, as Hau mentioned. Now, most of my reading of a lot of companies moving to low-cost countries are about manufacturing. So it's lower labor cost in manufacturing, or labor cost is low so that I can run a call center easier, or I can have the back office administrative work taken care of by the Indian programmers. Yeah. So that's the kind of, I think, general perception of moving to low-cost countries. But I think you have illuminated a different kind of nature of offshoring, which is going for talents. So these talents are doing what? Engineering, or supposedly we are startup companies, and innovation is is what we have. And are we going to outsource innovation so that you're left with nothing, potentially? So that seems to be a conflicting point. So maybe can you expand on what we meant by going for talents? What kind of innovations are we looking for in low-cost countries beyond pure hardcore manufacturing assembly, call center type?
Yeah, I mean, I'll give you an example. One of our companies is a software company. We needed to find people with lots of deep domain expertise using PeopleSoft. And there's a team of developers in Argentina that has been working with those applications for 10 years. And these are guys that our team has worked with before in their previous lives. If we want this level of expertise, it doesn't matter where they are in the world. Now, it's good that they happen to be in a low-cost location. That's fantastic. But it's because of the talent. But at the same time, I don't want to totally dismiss the cost thing. One of the reasons we moved to the Philippines in one of our other companies is because of the call center. They have huge call centers over there. And then we realized, hey, there's some pretty good people over here. We could get some of them to do sales as well. And then now it's not just about the call center. We also found that, hey, there's some engineering talent. There's some people in accounting. HR. We've built an entire organization over there. It's 200-300 people now, and the challenges I think for companies here is that if you do innovation outside, you're going to lose the core here. But I think if you have that attitude fundamentally, though, you're bound to fail. In our partnership, we like to talk about eventually you're going to see Chinese and Indian companies do more offshoring and outsourcing than U.S. companies. Indian companies already have thousands of employees in Eastern Europe, in China, because it's much lower cost. It's the companies that are able to work with across multiple cultures and have a well-functioning business organization globally. Those companies are going to win. And so you look at Toyota, 50 years after whatever they got started, they're going to manufacture 2 million cars a year in the U.S. They have manufacturing plants all over the place. You're going to see the Indian guys have U.S. operations and have U.S. employees. So who's going to win globally? It's the people who can leverage the talent globally.
Yes, Michael.
We're not seeing a lot of companies going offshore for design talent. Again, I'm not talking about high tech and in consumer products. I think there is a tendency to want to keep that in-house, probably just by organizational and human behavior of thinking, we're really good at this. We're not going to have someone else handle this. But I think at the same time, maybe ignoring what talents may be actually offshore. So as a result, Lee and Feng actually is starting to have more design people in Asia and providing design and products to our customers so that instead of saying, well, we can help you design, we'll actually give you a product that is well designed. So there's no infringement on we're starting to help you design. And as long as the customer is buying a full package that's well designed, they feel that is a good value proposition. So I think what I'm seeing is more suppliers are providing design talent. And maybe in the cost center and in software, they're developing their in-house capabilities and offering a full service to the customer so that there's not an organizational conflict and it's totally managed by the supplier.
Thank you. Actually, Clay, since with your work with building this partnership, for instance, what kind of product innovations are you talking about? Are these software innovations, or it could be hardware, semiconductor, or electronics?
In this case, the group, which is located in Poland, is a spin-off from Infineon. So they have silicon design expertise, and they have been dabbling with a variety of quite good customers for embedded systems. But 2 years ago, they took on their own their product line design of their own brand, and have sold it regionally successfully for VoIP VoIP equipment, and more recently triple play equipment. So because they've beaten out Cisco and Nortel and a few others in some sales, that validates for me that they can compete. But they're still a very modest size, and so validating the quality of work. Hau mentioned, expertise with the Argentinian group. You have to have something validate besides just, they're creative, they seem to have good qualifications, good degrees. If they've made and sold something in a competitive environment, that is a validation. And so I think that's what you'd want to look for. In terms of consumer products, various vendors worldwide, including internet software companies, address domestic markets and can validate that way. And then trying to bridge that into an international partnership may make more sense. Of course, then you have a global case with Skype, where their software is coming out of Estonia. So you can have examples of that kind too. Let me just mention a couple examples that are kept relatively quiet. A phenomenon here in this market with the big IT companies, and I'm coming from the IT industry, is that their gooses that lay the golden eggs in terms of design and development are kept very quiet because they don't want other companies coming in and competing for that talent. But through conversations and talking to the interesting people, vice president and above kind of level people in these companies, I've been able to have conversations with people from Intel, Motorola, Lucent, Nokia, Samsung, IBM, etc. And one primary example is Intel. Intel is very diversified globally. It has been for a long time. And the guts of their main products, Pentium and Citrino, the most complex aspects of those products are product managed out of Israel and actually designed in Nizhny Novgorod, Russia, and Gdansk, Poland. So that's not advertised or promoted as a fact very much by Intel, but that in fact is the case. And there's probably other elements that are coming along. They're bringing on new centers wherever they can see groups of talent, and I would have to think China and India are certainly playing a role in that. Motorola has built up a very large design center in Krakow as well, and they try to keep that quiet, but they often can't. So there's a dynamic there that has kept the real kind of genius centers, I think, low profile. But certainly those are examples, not for entrepreneurs, but for global trends. And entrepreneurially speaking, you want to see smaller pockets and spin-offs and innovations that you could, as an entrepreneur, latch onto in a partnership in a sector of your interest.
And also, I should just also say, when we talk about talent and about getting the best talent, sometimes it's not just identifying some expertise that might be somewhere else in the world and finding it. The reason that we care so much about it, and think about it this way, is that if you want to have good low-cost operations, so let's get back to the cost, and you want to make sure that those operations are successful, you want to make sure that those people are successful, which means you got to give them opportunities to learn and grow. You got to develop people. And so if you're going to give them the crappy projects that are not important to you all the time, they're not going to be very happy. So you have to treat them just like you treat employees here. You hire the best people you could find, and you develop them, you train them, you give them opportunities to learn and grow. That's how you motivate them. And so some of our companies that have been doing this for many years, we've had to do this by necessity to reduce turnover, to make sure. And sometimes it doesn't even matter if it's an outsourcing relationship or an offshoring relationship. So in the case of an outsourcing relationship, we've even done things like give some stock options, even though they're not part of our company. So we've done all kinds of things to make sure that we develop and retain good talent. Because once you have good people that you've developed, that you work with over 5 years, let's say you developed them, you do not want to lose them, right? And so over time, basically the core is going out to the edges. In the beginning, you don't start that way necessarily if you don't have the expertise and the talent there. But if you have good people and you have a good operation, it's going to naturally migrate that way.
One interesting thing, these guys are mostly talking about talent in the form of design, and I certainly didn't originally go overseas with the idea that we would be going to a more talented pool of manufacturers. I was truly and erroneously thinking that that was the cheaper way to go, which probably at full speed with a mature product line it is, and we're finding that now. Initially, it's for all the reasons that these guys have mentioned, it's extremely challenging to try to do, and ultimately, we ended up certainly giving up any cost advantage that we gained in glitch fixes and delayed supply chain, all the kinds of things that for a small company really put you off kilter. One interesting thing that I have found, because we have an interesting case because half my business is to the military, and so those products, or significant portions of those products, have to be domestically sourced. So I have duplicate products, identical products, being sourced through Virginia and through China. And that makes an interesting case study because there's literally no difference between them other than what I think we're generally seeing is that the Chinese products are better. And so that's a surprise because I think a lot of people assume, well, you're going to go overseas, you're going to save some costs, you're going to be giving up on quality. Well, that has actually not been the case with us. We found that probably a cost advantage now of at least 50% and better product. So that's been a pleasant surprise. It just took a while to get here to this point. So talent, but in manufacturing rather than design, is something that I've found to be interesting.
Fascinating, yeah. Do we have questions from the floor, points that you want to raise, or reactions to the comments that you have heard so far? Yes, please.
Sure. So, from a more, I guess, tangible, practical level, like how do you guys evaluate? You said you're trying to find vendors, you're trying to find people overseas that are really going to be helpful to the organization, and you're looking for quality. And what kind of filters do you put these people through, or do you put these companies through to actually evaluate these opportunities? Like say, I'm an entrepreneur, I want to go over there. And what's your process for doing that?
So let me just interject. Are we picking up the sound? Is it okay? Okay. So this is more for the sake of recording. Yeah. The question is that as you go overseas in offshores and list new vendors, what are the processes that you have to put in place to evaluate and to ensure that they are the right partners and they would work with you in a seamless fashion, right? Is that right paraphrasing? Yeah.
It is a matter of due diligence, no question. And I think you look at the international forums on the internet as well as going to trade shows, try to get them to be present there so you can meet with them, be it in their local region or in the U.S., and pursue references, just like evaluating anything on a due diligence basis. I think validating what they do, certainly with paid business is something you want to see. And, beware of any skeletons in the closet, in terms of profitability, stability, those kinds of things.
Yeah, we screen for attitude of the vendors today. Are they in this business with a long-term attitude, a long-term perspective? How do they treat their customers? Are they looking for partnership as well? Are they people we trust? I mean, it's real basic stuff, right? Whether it's outsourcing, choosing a vendor in the U.S. versus choosing a vendor in China, it's some of the same things you think about. Or hiring somebody, if it's offshoring, hiring somebody, you look for somebody who fits with your culture, right? There are some cultural issues as well, but the company has a culture, and so do they fit or not? Can they function, and do the processes match? So, and there's some practical things, like in software outsourcing, for example, we look at what kind of processes do they use? Do they use similar tools? What kind of source control tools do they use? Bug tracking tools? What kind of development methodologies are they compatible? Can we work together? So it depends on the specifics of the business as well.
I think Hau touched on trust, which again, I'm speaking from the perspective of the small business, because you largely, a big company obviously has more leverage, and so, but I still suspect it's important. It's vital as a small business trying to do this, because there are just a lot of things that are going to go wrong, and it would be absolutely impossible if you were the whole time, if you were wondering, and sort of gnawing at yourself over whether you're being taken advantage of, whether these are honest mistakes or whether they're mistakes that were the result of somebody trying to, substitute a cheaper component so that they could increase their profit on their end. That I think will tear the relationship apart pretty quickly to the point where you just can't do business. The one other point that I would mention, and I was able to do, is in evaluating vendors, is, do you have any points of leverage that you can borrow. So in my case, we had, from my previous career, I had relationships with the Hong Kong Special Duties Unit, which is their kind of paramilitary group, who manufactures all their stuff through this vendor. So I had both a reference and actually a credible, a little bit of leverage in that if this vendor was not, fair to me, there was a pretty good chance that it would impact their relationship with this much larger existing vendor. So, and I think in a lot of cases, if you have partners or alliances here in the States, you may be able to ask those people for a reference, and by implication, they're sort of vouching for that person. And so, that gives you a little bit more leverage than you would have as just yourself, right? So I'd consider that as well.
Yeah, I think Lee & Fung has built its whole business on addressing that pain, which is finding vendors around the world for our customers and making sure they're trusted, and also there's leverage if anything goes wrong. Because we typically pick vendors that we dominate their production over 60% of their capacity. So there's issues of recovery if things go wrong, to make sure that that's typically where you run into a lot of trouble, because no one's going to get it right the first several times. So I think it's in certain cases finding agents in the business, because they have long-term relationships with the factories, and as well as have a lot of volume in place in order to address any problems.
We've learned something interesting in that we recently made an investment in an outsourcing company. So now we've seen it from the other side, from a vendor perspective. How are they looking at it? And it's really interesting, because for those guys, they have a particular kind of business model, and what they screen for is customers, not projects. And if it's going to be just a project and it's a vendor arm's length relationship, it's not something that we're going to choose to do. If you go into it with the attitude that you're going to hold a gun to the vendor's head, right? And you do have to hold them accountable for results, right? But you're going to hold a gun to their head, and you screwed up, I'm not going to pay you now, or I'm going to withhold payment until you fix this thing, all right? Or if you have this kind of attitude where you really are not going to try to work with them in a collaborative partnership way, it's mutual, basically. It's both ways. You got to look for some people that you could really trust and have compatible values. You could work together, but you have to also be willing to make that commitment, because it's almost a self-fulfilling prophecy. We can see it when we see a customer who sort of have that kind of attitude. We're just not going to work with them, or if they give us some projects that are not mission critical because they don't trust us yet, and to some extent, we do have to do some of that to earn our I guess some credibility. But if we keep getting non-mission critical projects, well, guess what happens with non-mission critical projects? It doesn't get the management bandwidth required to make things successful. So when you have glitches, which always happen, and you have problems, and you don't have this interaction and communication because it's just not that important, it's a self-fulfilling prophecy, right? You have to make that commitment. It has to be important, and you have to make it work. Right?
Did you experience any problem with intellectual property stealing when you went offshore?
So the question is, in your experience, have you dealt with issues of intellectual property loss, or stealing intellectual properties? Yeah.
I think we've been somewhat lucky in that we have not had those issues, but it is always a concern. But again, that's why we have to be extremely careful about who we choose to do business with, right? Don't do business with somebody unless you're absolutely sure that they're people you want to be dealing with. And that's the same here in the U.S. as dealing with an offshore partner, right? Somebody, a vendor in the U.S. could just as easily steal your IP. That stuff like that happens all the time, right? Employees leave, especially a place like Silicon Valley where people just move around all the time. It might be even more of a concern here. Who knows?
We have a consumer product, and so we were very concerned right initially with just knockoffs. I mean, some number of product going right out the back door and off into other markets. I mean, local markets or European markets. I totally agree with the relationship is really crucial, because and you have to, as you're developing that, in my experience, there's going to be the issue of cost recovery that Michael raised is a classic example. Another one is cost of production. There's two negotiations that are going to go on, right? The cost of production, you got to decide how hard do you want to squeeze this vendor, and because if you squeeze them too hard, like I was just saying, that's not a partnership, and you're going to drive them either into bad behavior or just to drop you, right? It's just too much damn trouble, when in fact you may already be experiencing a significant cost advantage. So there's knowing what's fair. And then on cost recovery, same thing. Honest mistakes happen. So, okay, are you going to withhold payment completely, and make it all one-sided, or, all right, we're going to eat some of this, they're going to eat some of this, we're going to arrive in the middle. And if you do that, back to this question of IP, I think we have successfully built a relationship that is genuine at both, a personal level and a business level. We have become a big piece of their business now over time, from having been just a giant pain in the butt for a long time at a tiny little level. But, we built this trust to the point where now I really don't worry. And it would be very easy for our IP to go out the back door. We do exercise programs in the form of DVDs and laminated guides, and then we also do physical training products that let you train a machinery, basically, either of which could be copied, and either wholesale copied or chopped up and the IP kind of copied. But I would say our guys over there are more aggressive than we are. They're very concerned when we talk about distribution, because they've developed this business with us. They don't want it walking off. And so, the only protection you really have is back to the relationship point, I think. I'd be interested to hear what these guys have to say.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, in terms of IP, because we're dealing in fashion products, there's more knockoffs in the U.S. than there are in Asia. Our customers actually are more concerned about compliance, labor standards, environmental issues, because the last thing they want is for a crew of TV cameras to go in and say you're making products, with children labor. So there's a lot of scrutiny on making sure that the production conditions are good. But in terms of IP, I run into businesses where it is their business to basically go around the world, buy samples, and copy them. And even retailers come to us, not to us, to some of the companies that we look at and say, we'd like you to knock this off and, put a different label on it. It's rampant in the retail world. So a very different issue than technology.
Yeah, I would say technology, there's a few hot spots in the world where there's greater concern, where there's been some history of non-enforcement of intellectual property law. Even though the laws exist, are they enforced? And so the enforcement's been lax in a few parts of the world, and you just have to be aware of that if you're dealing in patents or other kinds of intellectual property. Some businesses have that as an issue. Others may not have that and may just, of course, be a first mover or create a brand that's not protected by patents. And in some cases, some businesses regard it as a sign of success if they're copied. But they're the only original, the only core brand or real one that people would choose to buy. So I think there's a spectrum of what's happening there. But information technology, clearly, when the designs become patentable, some cultures too aren't so, especially smaller companies overseas, are not so heavy on getting patents. It's expensive, as it is here, and they may need coaching if they're working with a patenting process to know how to go about that to make sure it's covered in their region as well as in the U.S. system.
Yes.
You mentioned that even if it's possible to go overseas right away with the product to manufacture, it might not be the best idea. Can you talk about when you've seen the best stage to do that is, and how you actually phase into that and phase out of production domestically? And then if you have any examples of when going overseas right away has actually worked, and what kind of criteria you would use?
Good. So let me repeat the question for Johnny. Yeah. The question is, since there was a comment earlier that says that maybe the best strategy is to first domestically build something, test it out, work it out, make sure the bugs are all cleaned before you move overseas. So what's the best timing to make that transition? Is there a good model? And also, and if you have examples to show where in some cases maybe it's better to go, it's okay to go right away. So what are the perhaps drivers or criteria that would say this product is better to test it out first inside domestically versus other situations where going overseas, like Randy's product, is fine on day one? Yeah, type.
I think for the first part, I always advise companies when you start to go offshore to manufacture, make it your second vendor, that you already have a primary vendor that's taking care of your domestic production. You've gone through the experience, and now you are starting a second production line offshore. And that's even our advice to companies that are already sourcing offshore when they now want to go into a new country or they want to go to another vendor. We always say make sure you've got your primary supplier in place. If something goes wrong with the secondary one that's cheaper, you have something to fall back on. Because every time it's a risk when you start with a new factory. And so I think, making sure that's in place. There's also, at least in our business, a different timetable when you produce offshore than when you do domestically. And sometimes that's a challenge because companies that have basically been telling their customers, I can make it domestically and turn it around in 3 weeks, now all of a sudden they go offshore, and their timetable now is 2 months. And can they train their customer to place orders early enough in order to adjust to an offshore manufacturing calendar? Times where I think small companies have done it well right off the bat are in situations where they already have a relationship with a vendor from either a previous business or they came from a business where they have strong relationships with one or two vendors, and they're able to leverage on that relationship right away into their new company.
So, Randy, did you go overseas on day one, or you have the Virginia set up first?
Yes, I'm wishing that I had the benefit of this panel about 4 years ago. Specifically, had Michael around to advise me, because I'm smiling over here because I did it precisely opposite from the way that he recommended, and I completely concur with him. Actually, we really, ironically, did exactly the opposite of what he said. We started here. I did have this pre-existing relationship that I could leverage. So that was what I thought was going to really give us, the advantage. Ironically, we got that relationship set up over there and stumbling and, working our way through it, dealing with exactly that 2-month kind of turn time, best case, and then added the domestic supply chain. And I should have done it precisely the opposite way, because the domestic supply chain, I'd worked in Asia for years, more than 10 years, extensively. And so I pretty well understood the overt cultural issues that you're going to run into and communication issues. But I still I underestimated, how the various ways that it would affect an early stage development effort. Whereas in Virginia, the price was significantly higher, but there's a much shorter turnaround, which means that your R&D and your beta feedback loop happens in a fraction of the time, maybe a quarter of the time that it takes if you're doing that with an overseas producer. And there is recovery is much simpler. It's much easier. So there's just a lot of efficiencies in doing it Virginia first. And then I guess I would agree, adding the second supply chain is a perfect opportunity to take that overseas. The one other thing I'd say is kind of lost my point. It'll come back to me, because there is another point that was in there, but I've lost it now.
Yes.
So I can see one from your viewpoint, because if you are running locally, you also take the parts out of the system. And then you want to build a relationship and go overseas. In terms of building the relationship, equity was mentioned, and finding the right agents was mentioned, people there that you mentioned. And I know this is situation dependent from consumer to fabless, but could you speak about that? How do you think about it? How do you go out there and find a relationship, build it, and pursue it?
So the question is that in building relationships with an offshore partner, what are good models, right? It was mentioned equity is one way. The other way is just direct funding or long-term contracts. So what are some good ways to establish a good relationships?
Yeah, I tell you that there are really no shortcuts. It takes time, in our Philippines operations, as an example, I mean, it takes a huge amount of commitment. The CEO decided to actually move his whole family over there because by the time you get to a couple of hundred people, and it's a lot of management challenges, and until we have the management team and infrastructure in place, he's going to stay. So you can't just build a good relationship through some contractual terms, right? It takes time and commitment. Whether it's here or overseas. So you have to be committed to developing that relationship with the people. There are no really easy answers, I have to say, unfortunately. At least I don't know. So
you have to be there. I think that in an entrepreneurial setting, that would have to be usually, I mean, this is just a ballpark swag, being there every 2 months, if not more often, to work with the product teams and bring things forward. And in some cases, it might
dinner
be
with them, go drinking. You do all kinds of stuff.
Well, that's relationship building, but at actual work, reviewing it on site helps. In addition to all the electronic communications you can do in the meantime. Now that may change a little bit with all the new things that are on the table or on the roadmap for high definition video conferencing. Of course, the systems are going to still be fairly expensive, but the prices are supposed to come way down, whereby entrepreneurs can rent office time that has that equipment in it. And if they have it on the other end, from what I understand, some of these conferencing systems will blow away anything that's available today and make you feel like you're really there in front of somebody. So that may help a bit, but of course, the wine and dine aspect needs its attention also.
There's some, I think, relatively simple, actually, mechanisms to separate you and build a relationship, and some of it is just paying on time. That we find that if you pay your vendors on time, they are so surprised because everybody else is in the game of stretching out their payables. Mm-hmm. So we actually have a practice and tell our companies, if you want to build a relationship, pay on time. And you'll be one of the only ones that actually pay them on time. And something as simple as that makes a huge difference in the way they view you. And also, there are times where we will actually go in and actually help some of our vendors with working capital. Cash, I think, just goes a long way. If we know that they are, having working capital problems, we'll actually extend them some credit. Or if they need some machinery, we'll lend them some money to buy machinery. It gives us very strong signal that we're actually helping you to build your business on top of the personal relationship. Mm-hmm. And they remember that because no one else does it.
And choose your battles, right? Because paying on time, we pay on time religiously, and our vendors are so happy about it. And also choosing the battles, it's back to that cost being fair, essentially. And then I also, the first year, I spent, I was in Hong Kong every other month, for sure. Because any time that I wasn't, something was going amiss. The one other point came back to me that I just think is interesting before we leave that subject of, when to add that second supply chain. For a consumer product, and certainly Michael has a broader experience here than I do, but what I can say that I think is a general good rule of thumb is if you build that business originally in the business plan and it can be profitable with a domestic supply chain, then you're adding value by decreasing costs later on. But the business can survive and thrive, right, based on your domestic supply chain. not the other way around. I would never want to be in a position where my main point of differentiation and advantage was a low-cost supplier overseas, because if anything goes wrong with it, you're in deep, deep trouble.
This comment about paying on time reminded me of something that Warren Buffett once said, giving advice to young people. Like, hey, how do you find a good person to marry, right? Well, the best way to find a good partner is to be a good partner, to be worthy of, being married to. Because if you're going to find a great person, that person by definition is not going to be an idiot. And if you're not worth marrying, you're not going to find that person. So, you've got to look within. Yeah.
I think some of a thought that comes along this line too, from what Randy said and what everyone said here, is that if you get in a low-cost game, for any business model almost, that's very dangerous. Even if you're offering your customers a lower-cost product, believe it or not, some distribution channels kind of shrug their shoulders at that and say, well, that means I mark it up, and that means I get less markup, so I make less money too. So looking for value add, more customer value, more value proposition is a much better route to developing a business, to getting funding, all those good things, and also working with vendors.
Other comments, questions? Yeah. Yes, please.
How do you consider government regulations and policies when you enter a country?
Yeah.
And how big of an effect is it?
So the question is, how do you consider government regulations and policies in your offshoring decisions, and how big a factor is that?
Well, I think those are decisions you make once, and then after that, once you feel comfortable doing business, let's say in China, we've done business now with a lot of different companies. We're over that hurdle. When you enter a new country like Ukraine, it's the first time we're doing business there. Yeah, at first we're very cautious and concerned, and we got to meet a lot of people and get comfortable with that the government is not going to interfere. But it is always risky, I think. We're very lucky to be in this country where you have good protection for IP, and you understand how business is done. The government is not going to get in the way. And we've had problems, frankly. One of our Chinese companies had filed to go public, and the government changed certain regulations and completely changed the business on us. And so those kinds of things will happen overseas. It's just part of life. Yeah.
I mean, some of those regulations even occur in larger countries. Germany has a law which requires a majority vote of stockholders for any change in a stock options plan. And therefore, a company like SAP doesn't offer stock options in Germany. It offers stock options here and most other countries, but in their home country they won't offer stock options because they can't change the plan without a majority shareholder vote. So with a startup, that could be a trip point, I would think, as well. So entrepreneur, startup friendly rules need to be looked at.
Another question, like as far on an individual level, like what kind of skills do you feel that like the best leaders in global operations have, like as far as being able to manage these relationships and find the right opportunities? What's been your guys' experience? Like what are people that are really good at this, and what do they possess on an individual level?
So the question is, the individual level, what kind of attributes are you looking for people who would be good in managing both relationships as well as identifying opportunities when you're talking about working with offshore partners?
I love this question because I tell you, I mean, what I like to say is, look, people who are very good managers onshore are going to be very good managers offshore. People who are lousy managers onshore are going to screw it up offshore as well. And so I tell you, I mean, it's just basics, right? Somebody who listens, somebody who has good judgment, somebody who cares about their people, can develop their people, can motivate them. Those people will be successful developing offshore operations or outsourcing, dealing effectively with partners. So I don't know if there's any secret sauce, but I'm curious to hear the other panelists.
I would echo that, but I would say I think it's also an advantage for sure to have had some experience at some point earlier in the career dealing with the cultures in which you're going to be working. I mean, this sounds really obvious, but there are some funny illustrations that we have had because I kind of handed over largely the management of my supply chain through China to my chief operating officer, who's a very bright guy, a lawyer from Harvard. I forgive him that, but he very, very bright guy. Lots of he's been in really on the business side far more than the law side throughout his career. Managed lots of people, very good manager here. But one funny area was that he hadn't dealt with sort of issues of communications, interpersonal communications with Chinese, and there is a fundamentally, there are some issues in the way that we being an American Western-oriented party would address a discussion that are just fundamentally different than the way that someone in China or in a completely different way in the Middle East. And if you haven't had some experience with that, you really can get yourself worked up for the wrong reasons. And so, delivering bad news is just, often done in a different way, even if the relationship's there. And so I think some cultural sensitivity goes a long way to avoid careening off a cliff over nothing. It's the tempest in a teacup thing. When in fact the guy's just, he's looking at you like, God, why is he such a, boorish bastard? I'm just trying to communicate. So I would add that a little bit of cultural familiarity would help.
Yeah, but I would say that boorish bastard is not going to be successful here either. Right, but I do agree 100% that it does take. You have to be open-minded, and you have to learn that new culture, right? And so, assuming that you're a person with good judgment and you're open-minded and you're going to listen, you have to pay attention. So you do things. Certain cultures are not going to be as upfront with you, so you have to tune into what how do they react, and then certain cultures, for example, we had some teams in the Philippines where to reduce turnover, we've learned that there's a lot of peer pressure amongst people, and so instead of we would assign basically bonuses based on turnover targets for the group, and so you don't want to let your group down. You're not going to be leaving, right? And your group of 10 people, and you're going to self-manage that. So, or in that culture, Christmas party is a big deal. Like, people talk about their Christmas party, and if your company has a good Christmas party, you're working for a really good company. And if you don't have a Christmas party, man, you better be looking for another job. So, there are specific things like that, but you just have to go there and pay attention and learn the culture, learn the specifics of this new environment. But if you're paying attention and if you're open-minded, you'll do fine. You can't get the answers right away. It's just not that easy.
My only comment to add to what you said, and I agree with everything, is that I think we as Americans have a bias because everyone here speaks English, and I find it even in myself that when I'm in another country and someone doesn't speak English very well, there's a frustration level and almost an assumption that, well, maybe he or she doesn't know what they're talking about. And it really wakes me up when I then hear them speak in Chinese, which is my mother tongue, and they're so eloquent and they're so knowledgeable. And I go, oh my gosh, this is my own bias being put into a global situation. And so I think the best people who can deal in a global world is able to suspend that and say, all right, just because someone isn't communicating to me effectively, because we're so influenced by good communication skills, that doesn't mean that person doesn't understand what they're doing. And I think, that knowledge to me and that awareness is very important.
May I ask the final questions?
Specific question for Randy, and then also some follow-up from the panel. I guess what were some of the key problems in just starting up with the Chinese supplier ongoing? What were kind of the one or two major issues, and how long did it take for that process of initially starting with the vendor to actually getting it running smoothly? And in general, I guess, for the whole panel, how long does that process take to actually start with the vendor and then actually have the production line or whatever it is you're doing over there have it be working smoothly?
we had several problems with component substitutions, but the overarching problem was actually, I really believe, it was honest and genuine. There was no nefarious motive behind this. It was that the manufacturer simply did not understand how to use these products, really the use of this product. The fitness isn't a big deal over there, certainly not this kind of athletic training. And so without the ability to sit together on a regular basis, and I would have done a much better job in retrospect really making sure that they understood how this product was going to be used, because a component substitution, well, this one looks like this one, and hey, maybe there's a cost advantage, maybe not. Well, it ends up having a huge impact if it doesn't work, right? And you never would have known that unless you really understood the product. That was the big thing in the early stage, was we were trying to have our beta product stay static so that we could go out to our user base and find out the lessons that we were going to find out from them. But little glitches in the beta manufacturing process kept happening as a result of lack of understanding on our manufacturer's part that really mapped back to my failure to communicate that well. That kept throwing us off, right? Because you can't have a beta product out there if you're having to do a recall. You don't find out what the user's going to do with it because you're busy recalling it because it has a material defect. So that probably took us off course by a good 6 or 8 months. And that was a very painful kind of lesson. Was that
That's my question. And the second was in general, assuming that, I guess in general, is it 6 to 8 months for other types of products as well, or what's kind of the time frame you're looking at in terms of going from working with a supplier and actually getting a finished product to market of using an overseas supplier in other people's experiences?
I don't know if there's a rule of thumb, actually. It really varies on the product and the country and the complexity. It's hard.
If it's a product that they've never manufactured before like this, it's going to take a while. And sometimes the overseas partner is much more expert than partners here, right? As an example, one of our companies makes components for PC manufacturers and so on, and all the best suppliers are in Taiwan, and they're teaching us. I mean, they're telling us what's wrong with our design and what to change and so on. So it just depends on the product. Yeah.
Well, the final question that I raise is, are there any other additional perspectives that you want to share with the audience, mistakes that should be avoided, or good lessons that one should do when you do leverage low-cost countries offshore?
Sure.
Yeah, yes,
something that came up to my mind just in the last round of questions too is something that applies to any startup situation, whether or not you go offshore, but it's certainly with offshoring and what your partner's doing, and that is how focused are they on your project? Do they have adequate resources to address your project? And if you're looking at your own business plan, are you focused enough on a mission and a value proposition? And the classic claim or observation, I don't know who first coined it, with startup analysis and advice recently has been, most companies don't die from starvation, in other words, from lack of funds. They die from indigestion, which is lack of focus and trying to do too many things. And so if they are trying to take on too many projects and your project is just one in the portfolio, are they really addressing that in the time frame that you would like? So, and if they're totally dedicated or jumping into something that's going to require a lot of work in a design sense, for example, then you want to make sure that that has adequate priority and focus for them. Manufacturing, of course, they're always going to have other projects, and that's a bit of a different question, but still applicable.
Thank you. Any other final word from Randy or Michael or Hau?
No, I think my main point was that it's not about cost. It's about competitiveness. It's about having something, refining your business model, making a business that works, and whether you use offshore or onshore, it doesn't really matter. If you happen to be able to use offshore because that's where the best talent is or best partners are, certainly go for it. But focus on what it takes to innovate and differentiate yourself in the global market, because the world is becoming more global. But I think the cost factor is just, I think it's way too heavily. I don't think that's the key driver.
I would just restate the one point that I mentioned before, but I think it's so important, particularly for small startups, is really make sure that you've got a business that works here. You know, and if you can't make it pencil out here, then you better think about another business, because I really would be very reluctant to build a business that was, you know, predicated upon having a cost of production advantage for a small company. You know, that's may apply really well to Walmart, but for the little guy, you better have a business that works here in the States first.
Yeah, if you have an arbitrage situation, it's not sustainable, right? That's just no way to build a business, a long-term business.
Good. Michael?
No, I think I echo what everyone else has already said.
Okay. Well, thanks very much. I want to thank the panelists and everyone.